Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about complex numbers and roots. And I'm actually probably going to split this up into two videos because I have a lot of information to get to you. So we'll get started. Now, complex numbers is something that's completely new, completely different than what you are used to, because it's a completely different way of thinking. And so you're probably sitting there over there going, oh, great, something new, something I'm not used to. But I promise if you work through it with me that it's going to make sense and you're going to get it. It's just a matter of being very systematic about how you approach these. Okay, so we're going to get into the idea of an imaginary number. And what is an imaginary number? And this is something that's totally new to you because your whole life in math class you have been told that you cannot take the square root of a negative number. And I am here to tell you that in fact you can. I know, it's crazy, but you can do it. And so that's what we're going to talk about, and that's where this whole idea of imaginary numbers come into play. And you might say, well, this is crazy. Why would anybody even do this? Actually, it's used a lot in electrical engineering. It has to do with circuits and all these different kinds of things, but it is a pretty big math concept. It's really big in Algebra 2, and you're going to be using it a lot and seeing it a lot, so it's important that you understand it. Okay, so an imaginary number, by definition, is simply this. It is defined by the square root of -1, and that is equal to I. Okay, just a lowercase I. That's all it is. And by definition, that's what I is equal to. And it was a famous mathematician that came up with it many, many, many years ago. We're talking like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. He came up with this idea because this allows us to take the square root of a negative number. So for example, now that I know this, because this is the definition of what an imaginary number is, we now have these imaginary units that we can use. And that allows me to take the square root of any negative number. I can in fact sit here and say, okay, well, the square root then of -4, I actually know what that is. I can say, well, I can rewrite -4 as the square root of -1 times 4. And I know that the square root of -1 is I, and I know that the square root of 4 is 2, and so the answer then is 2I. And so that negative is what's allowing you to put this in terms of I. Okay? And it seems really strange and really foreign at first, but I promise you it's something that will makes sense because it is something that you can actually do. So for example, if I have the square root of -2. Now this is a little bit different as far as how you write it, because in this first problem, this 4 is a perfect square, so everything comes out from under the radical. Here, 2 is not a perfect square, so that's going to stay under the radical. So you can think of this as -1 times 2. We said the square root of -1 is I, so that comes out from under the radical, but you still have a 2 left under the radical. So the idea here is that when you have a number that's no longer under a radical, the I would come after it when you write it. That's the proper notation. When you still have something under the radical, the I gets put in front of it. Okay, and you're probably over there going, okay, that's nice, Mrs. Lee, I still don't understand what it is you're talking about. We'll do a couple more examples. Okay, anytime you see a negative under your radical, what I want you to do is this. I want you to say, well, that means I'm going to have an I in my answer. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I can say, well, this whole thing is the same as saying 3I times the square root of +16. And so now I've already addressed that negative, and now I'm just going to simplify my radical. Square root of 16 is 4, and it's 3I times 4. 4 times 3 is 12. So that just gives me 12i. Okay. Now, I acts just like any other variable, right? You can't add I and a whole number, which we'll get into in a second. So treat it like a variable, right? You have to combine like terms and things like that. Okay. So the idea here then with I, when you simplify your square roots, make sure that you address the I first. I think that's going to make your life a lot easier. So for example, I have negative square root of negative 75. Let's address the negative that's under the radical first. That tells me I'm going to have an I in my answer. This negative that's in front has nothing to do with the negative that's underneath. So I have to keep that negative that's out in front. Because I have a negative under the radical, I know I'm going to have an I in my answer. And because I now have the I in there, I can just deal with a positive square root. Now, the factors of 75 would be 3 and 25. Here's my perfect square. The square root of 25 is 5. So I have negative 5i times the square root of 3. Okay, so you'll see I combined several different concepts about square roots all in this one problem. But it's important that you understand that negative underneath tells you you're going to have an I in your problem. Once you put the I in there, then you get rid of that negative under the radical. And then you're just simplifying. Okay? Let's try one that tends to throw people off. Sometimes people see fractions in general, whether it's with a square root problem or not. And then they're like, there's a fraction, because people don't like fractions. And fractions are really not that bad if you kind of understand what's going on here. I am going to address this problem the exact same way I addressed every other problem. Because there's a negative under the radical, I know that means that I have to have an I in my answer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take out the negative from underneath and replace it with the I out in front. And so now I have I times the square root of 1 over 36. If you remember back when dealing with radicals, you can, when you have a fraction under a radical, you can go ahead and write it as a radical over a radical. Okay? And the square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 36 is 6. Because this is a number that doesn't have a radical anymore, the I gets written after it. So you end up with 1/6i. Okay, so that is a little bit about simplifying square roots when you have negatives underneath. A really, really, really important thing for you to know is this. And this is super important. It's going to come up a lot as we work through these problems. So make sure, I'll actually do this in red. Make sure that you somehow put this in your head somewhere along the way. I squared, and I know this probably doesn't make sense right now, but it is going to come up later, and I'll bring it back up when it does. I squared, if you think about the definition of I is the square root of negative 1 squared. And we said whenever you square a radical, you get back what's under the radical, and so that would give me negative 1. Okay, so the takeaway here is that I squared is always going to equal negative 1. Make sure that you know that, you somehow ingrain that in the brain, figure out a way to remember that, but that's something that you need to make sure that you know. Okay. So let's talk about, and look, it didn't transfer over when I put my my thing in this electronic whiteboard. So I'll go ahead and rewrite. I'll rewrite the quadratic equation. So you can just disregard this mess over here. So let's say our equation is x squared is equal to negative 81. Now, in order to solve that, to solve for x, I need to take the square root of both sides. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Now, what is important here, when you take the square root of something that's squared, you just get back what was squared, so that would give me x. Because I put in this square root symbol in order to solve it, remember the square root wasn't in my original problem, but because I put it in there in order to solve it, I have to account for the fact that x can be positive or x can be negative. So I have to make sure I put in that plus or minus. Okay? And now I'm going to go ahead and solve this. So I have plus or minus the square root of negative 81. Remember that negative under the radical tells me I'm going to have an I in my answer. So that gives me plus or minus I times the square root of 81. Square root of 81 is 9. So then my answer is going to be plus or minus 9I. Okay? It would look really funny if we put I9. That's why we always put it after the number. Okay, so that's solving a quadratic equation when you're dealing with imaginary numbers. We'll try another one here. Okay, let's say that our equation, again, it didn't transfer over, but we'll just write it out. Let's say my equation is 2x squared plus 64 is 0. Okay, so again, I'm going to go ahead and solve it. First thing I want to do, because this is my only x term, I want to isolate that. So I end up with 2x squared is equal to negative 64. And from there, I'm just going to divide both sides by 2. And that leaves me with x squared is equal to negative 32. And now, because I am taking the square root of both sides, right? In order to solve that, I have to put in the square root on both of those, okay? And when I do that, remember that allows me to just write x over here because I'm taking the square root of something that's squared. Remember, I have to put the plus minus in on this side. Okay? And that negative under the radical tells me I'm going to have an I in my answer. I'm just going to write up here because I'm just running out of room on the bottom. So that tells me then I have to simplify square root of 32. Factors of 32 would be 16 and 2. That's a 6 there. 6 is my perfect square, or excuse me, 16 is my perfect square, so that's what's going to come out from under the radical. So I have plus or minus 4I radical 2, and that is my answer. Okay, so that is just a quick little video on solving or explaining what an imaginary number is, solving some basic quadratic equations. Remember, by definition, that I is equal to the square root of negative 1, and that is allowing us to take the square root of negative numbers. In the upcoming video, the second video in this lesson, will be more information on how to solve quadratic equations. We'll do a little bit more complex quadratic equations, and I'll show you how to solve those. Okay, these problems that I'm putting in this video pretty much model the assignment that you have to do, so make sure that you understand these problems. You're writing them down. That way it'll make it a lot easier when you go to do the assignment. Okay, so I'll see you in a few minutes with the second part of our video. All right, everybody, take care.